Just to introduce myself very quickly, my name is Richard Gosnod and I am a photographic artist based in Northern Ireland, and I'm a member of the Belfast Photo Factory. We're a small collective who meet in Belfast. Samantha Obman is also going to be presenting this evening as well. And are you there, Samantha?
I am here, but I'm unable to start my video because it says the host has stopped it. But I can introduce myself in the meantime. So I'm Samantha Obman. I'm originally from the US, but I've lived in Belfast for about 3 years now. So I'm also a photographic artist, and I've been in the Photo Factory since earlier this year. So I'll pass it back to you, Richard, then, so you can talk about the factory.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much. Okay, so what I'll do is, before we get into the books, I will I'll just start off by explaining what we do at the Photo Factory. And I'm going to share my screen here. And hopefully you can see that. Can you give me a thumbs up, Samantha, if you can see that?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, so we are a collective of photographic artists, and we are actually based in Northern Ireland, and we have a member in Scotland as well. And we hold regular photo book discussion groups. Previously, we would meet them, we would meet in person in Belfast. We would also have photography related film nights, and we've collaborated on exhibitions as well. But due to the pandemic, our face-to-face discussion group has kind of ceased. But it was instigated to celebrate photo books as physical, tangible objects. Now, we can't meet to do that, but we also wanted to bring together people who shared an interest in the concept, form, and design of photo books, and to encourage a dialogue around that, around the narrative that they may illustrate. And that is possible over the internet. So we recently started holding Zoom events, and although it's no substitute for holding the physical book, it does give us wider reach. The books are chosen from our personal libraries. We also have access to the libraries at the Belfast School of Art, Ulster University, and Source magazine as well. And our aim is to run these events on a regular basis. We try it for monthly. It doesn't always work out that way, but we try to hold the events on a monthly basis. And previously, our events have been themed. So we would look at a number of books around certain themes, such as diaristic, portrait, mental health, and family. So just to look at some of the books, some of the artists, we cover a diverse range of artists. So we've discussed books from artists such as Mark Neville. This one is from Laura Hospice. She's a Dutch artist. Richard Billingham, Lorenzo Vittori, Leonie Hampton, Ricardo Cassis, Sophie Carl, Anders Peterson and Jacob Usoborn, Nan Golding, Paul Brown, Yoshikatu Fuji, Kim Boovey, Rob Hornstra, Arlene Gottfried, Alex Soth, and then most recently Yukari Chikura. And when we meet, we look at things that make a book interesting as a whole concept. So we're not discussing catalogues or retrospective collections. We look at the book design, the edit, the sequence, and how all of these components work together to aid in the flow and the rhythm of each book. And also how the design and the book extends the narrative. For example, is there a tension or is there a humor in the work? Okay, so we look at the photo book. We view the photo book as a means of expression, and we believe that everything in the book should be there for a reason. So that would entail the cover, the material that's on the cover, whether there's a photograph, whether there's text, the binding affects how the pages lay and how the book opens. Any text within the book and the location of that text and the typeface, the design, whether it's complex or simple, the paper stock. Some artists use different types of paper. It gives a different feel when you're turning the pages. Other devices which are used to tell the story and control the pace of the narrative, for example, blank pages, spacing of the images, image position, or even chapter sections, and the sequence and how the images before and after any given image influence our interpretation of that image. So things you see before the photograph that you're looking at stay in your mind. And these are all different things that we look at when we're engaging with a book. Also pairing of images, images on opposing pages or not, the color and the shape of the images and how they work together. And we come from the view that the images aren't individual in a book, they complement each other. So this could be contrasting. So an image could be strikingly different to another one, which kind of jars the reader. We'll look at repetition of images and motifs and symbols and colors, which run throughout the work. And then finally, we'll look at the edit, so the type of images and the number of images and how they all communicate with each other. So that is it, actually. So I'm going to stop sharing and hand over to Samantha, and she's going to take us through the first book.
All right, so I'm bringing it up now. So let me just fast forward it a little bit. All right, so to start, the book that I'll be talking about for my portion of this evening is Mother River by Wang Preston. So while I'm going through the video, I'm going to read a short excerpt from her website so you can get a kind of idea of what the book is about for people who are unfamiliar. So I'll start this. So Mother River is a breathtaking photographic odyssey by British-Chinese photographer Wang Preston. It takes the viewer on a journey along the entire 6,211 kilometers of the Yangtze, China's Mother River, from the remote high Tibetan plateau through the Three Gorges and on to the river's end in Shanghai. This stunning series of color photographs captures the dramatic shifts in landscape and offers fresh perspectives on China's present-day development. Preston uses Google Earth to identify the coordinates of 63 locations marking 100 kilometers of the river's course. It was these 63 Y points that she set out to reach and to photograph come what may. This method avoided most of the picturesque views or colossal concrete structures, which are frequently visited by photographers. Instead, a set of accidental and vernacular landscapes were found and photographed. Many locations have rarely or never been photographed by a traveler before. Over a period of 4 years, 2010 to 2014, the artist made 9 field trips into incredibly diverse and often remote terrain. She uses a large format field camera, the kind used by 19th century pioneering explorers. Since the river source is 5,400 meters above sea level, and half of its length flows through some of the most majestic mountains on Earth, Mother River is a modern-day adventure. The intrepid photographer faced many of hazards, including altitude sickness, mudslides, earthquakes, sandstorms, floods, and wild dogs. Such conditions made the journeys unpredictable. 2 photo locations could not be reached, and some films were loaded back to front by mistake. Preston embraced such apparent failure by including 2 blank pictures and 2 wrong pictures in the final narrative, highlighting performativity as an inherent part of the project. Mother River demonstrates that in an era of abundant satellite mapping and saturated imagery, fresh views can still be attained with ambitious physical and personal mapping. All right, so to kind of, let's see. All right, so to kind of explain the plan that she has listed on her website. So Number one, she wanted to divide the entire 6,211 kilometers of the Yangtze River into 62 equal sections. So each section is 100 kilometers long, and then she marked the 63 dividing points, including the start and end points. So you can see them a bit on the sides, on the left side. So they'll say Y45 or something like this, and then how far they are from the river source. So it's done chronologically. So she starts at Y1 at the river source, and then she locates each dividing point as precisely as possible, regardless the cost. She photographs only these dividing points with a large format film camera, whatever they are. And then 3, she repeats this process 63 times until Y63, the river mouth, is reached and photographed. So we're nearing the end of the book here. So at the end, you can see the journey record of each specific Y point. And so they have it in Chinese and in English, and then the acknowledgements. So I'll let it flip over, and then I'll switch to my presentation. Okay, so this is the cover of the book. But so the photographer, as I said, is Preston, who is a British Chinese photographer. She has done other work regarding the Chinese landscape and cultures surrounding this in the past. So she has one project called He River Together, which reenacts her efforts to be one with the Yangtze River. So in this project, she also talks about how the Yangtze is the home to more than 40% of China's population. So she says it's the physical carrier of Chinese history. As well, she has a series called Forest, which she did in 2010 to 2017, which is a series of images depicting reforestation in China. So as you can see kind of on the side and the front, the publisher is Hachikans. So they publish art, photography, design, and architecture books with a focus on contemporary art. So the book was published in 2018, so it has 160 pages and 71 of them are illustrations. So as you can see, I'll hold up the book here. So it is hardcover and the size is 33 centimeters by 27.5 centimeters. And so I'll start with my first impressions, kind of, I guess, of the image chosen for the front of the book. So the image is from Y point 61, which is 6,000 kilometers from the river source. So from the index, I could find that this is the Yangtze River, but also it's near a port. So I think it was a good choice, or at least effective, in having it as the cover, because it encompasses many of the ideas and imagery that I think she explores within the book along the river. So we have some of what we see later on as well, such as like the modernization and industry within China to the right, which I believe is an oil rig, but someone can correct me later if it's not. And then we have some of the ships moving in the background. But then there's also a bit of a softer side, which comes out in the book as well, where we see the people at the river's edge and perhaps a mother and her young son, which also bring back the idea of the mother river. And also, I think, just kind of the culture and the livelihood of the people who live along the river, such as this man with the fishing net. Another thing that the cover is something I noticed is this woman on the left who is in red and reading a book in red or some paper in red. But red is something that popped up throughout the book as kind of a motif. So you can see it in the oil rig as well. And it's a bit difficult to see in this picture, but the words Mother River are in red as well. And you can see from the video that the end pages were red and some of the subheadings in the book are red as well. So I'll talk a bit more about that later when we're looking at some of the images I chose. But as well in the cover, I think when it's folded out like this, it matches kind of the interior of the book as well, where we have a blank page with just the Y point and then a picture on the right. So I think it fits well with how the book is shown as well. So there's quite a bit of text in the book as well. So this is the first text that comes up, and it's also one of my favorites from the book. So it's entitled Song for the Long River. So I won't read it out to you, but I think the reason I chose to show it is that I think it's a nice entryway into the work, and kind of brings about the general emotion of the work as well, and brings into light the river itself, but I think more deeply than that, the feeling of the river and seeing it as kind of having a life of its own, not only as a place where people have gathered and live around with a variety of cultures, but also something, I guess, that is a river and it feeds flowers and the earth, and something that has strength and kind of an identity of its own, but also one that contributes to others' identity. So this one is at the beginning of the book, and then there are two other texts at the beginning. There's a foreword written by Jem Seven, who is a landscape photographer who works and lives in Southwest England. And there's also an essay by Liz Wells. So the essay is something that I also thought was worth talking about. It's called Frontiers of Vision on Photographic Explorations, Identity and Myth. So I think it gives some background into Jan Preston herself, but also more insight into the myth surrounding the river, and some of the visual language surrounding this that's seen within the images. And it starts by discussing that Jan grew up in central China, but then moves to this quote that I found helpful in understanding more about Mother River. But it was only when distant from her homeland, having moved to England in 2005, that she started to reflect on the myth of the Yangtze as her mother river, and on the ways in which this contributes to Chinese identity. Arguably, motherhood implies a natural force and emotional attachment, as well as referencing the unifying notion of family. In effect, the project emerged from Preston questioning her own sense of identity given her relocation. It also talks a bit about performances that Preston did along the river, but I just haven't included it in this presentation for time reasons. So then at the end of the book, there are a few more texts as well, and one of them has to do with this image shown here, or lack of image. So this is Y16, which is 1,500 kilometers from the river source. And so it is a blank image because she was unable to reach the Y point. And so in the last text of the book, she has what's called the diary of the failed attempt to reach Y16. So it's a story about the blank pages, because there's this one and then there's one on the page before it as well. So I thought it provided a nice kind of inside view into the thought processes behind the journey and what went into the capturing of each image. So here she speaks about, amongst other things, being bitten by a dog and worrying about finding a rabies vaccine, to searching for 2 days to find this point, only to find that it's unreachable. But also describing how she found a small stream that she describes as one of the most beautiful things she's ever seen. So I think as an ending, it's just kind of lovely to read her thoughts after viewing the imagery, and to kind of consider it more deeply after looking at the entire book. So as we saw in the video as well, you can see the exact points of each Y point. And so this is another image that's included in the book, and I've included it so it's more helpful to understand what I'm talking about when I talk about Y points. So as you can see, this is the Yangtze River, and you can start on the left at Y1, which is the river source, going all the way to the end near Shanghai, which is Y63. And so each point is 100 kilometers from the next one, and these are the points where she took each photograph. So starting with the imagery, so here we have Y2, which is 100 kilometers from the river source. And so this is generally how the book is shown. So we have the blank white page on the left with the location of the Y point and an image on the right, with a few exceptions, including the one with the blank page. And there's one double spreaded page with 2 images later on in the book. So as you can see in this one, this is most of what the pictures look like near the beginning. It's kind of a snowy mountainous region. And I think, as I said, the book reads chronologically. So it starts with Y1 and then it goes all the way to Y63. And so as you go along the way, you can kind of see it change from snowy and bright to more dry industrial land. So you can see geographic changes, but you can also start to see changes amongst the cultures along the way as well, which I think is really interesting to see. So it sort of feels like a road trip, I guess, which kind of speaks to my American background, I guess. But one thing that did stand out to me with these images, and so I'll do one here as well, is the connection of the shapes in a lot of the images. So even when the river is not seen or easily present, you can find hints to it, I think, in a lot of the shapes. So especially in this image, like we have the river here in this obviously, but there's also this log on the side that kind of matches the way a river flows. And then there's the mountainous region in the background that matches this as well. Or even something as simple as this road that curves off to the side a little bit. So it feels as if, to me, the book moves along like a river, and it feels as if the river is affecting its surroundings and kind of passing on its identity, creating these shapes. Or even in such as this image with the white parts in the mountain almost feel like a river to me as well, or kind of the windy road on the side. So I guess I found myself kind of searching for these within the images as well. But it did, the sequencing of this, where I was kind of connecting to the shapes, felt effective for me because it did help me to read the book kind of as a river. So outside of the kind of landscape images, she does a lot of other things within the book as well to document the river that I thought were interesting to see. So it feels almost as if it's not just a documentation of the river in a traditional documentary sense, but she documents, I think, the feeling of the river and gives a sense of what it might be like to be standing there during the journey. And I think it creates a nice break in the sequence of the book. And to me, made me consider more than just what the river looks like visually. So here we have Y3, which is 200 kilometers from the river source. So only 100 kilometers from the first image I showed with the mountains. So since it's near the beginning, it's still in the snowy mountainous region, but I think it gives a nice sense of the movement of the water with the blurred ice and snow. And I think it gives a sense of what maybe it would be like to be there. I think this image does a similar thing within the book and is nice in the sequence. So this one is quite a ways away from the first one. So this is Y37, which is 3,600 kilometers from the source. So this part of the river is near a city and is a different color in the water from the other one. So this one is very blue and this one's turning kind of a grayish color. So it shows the changes within the river itself and kind of the landscape. So it also has the sense of movement with the kind of blurred grass in the front and the flowing water. But I think it gives kind of a sense of place. So when I look at this image, it makes me feel kind of as if I'm standing on the river's edge and looking at the movement of the water. Specifically, I think because there's nothing else chosen to be shown within the image. So I think this was nice to add to the book. Another way that she shows the identity of the river and its surroundings is through photographing people. So most of the people in the images shown in the book aren't really posed. It's just kind of them living and participating in their daily lives. So it seems important as the images always kind of show the landscape in the background. Like I believe in this one behind this red sign is the river. And then we have ones like this that continue kind of the shape of the river in the mountain in the background, or this man here with the shape in the concrete. So I think it seems important that the images show the landscape in the background. I think it kind of highlights the location and connects back to the river as the mother river, which perhaps impacts their identity and culture as well. So this one is my favorite image from the book, but it's also the one where I started to notice a kind of red motif. So you can see it in this one, but also in smaller ways within the book, such as the color of the man's motorcycle or the columns in the building, or even like this umbrella in the background. But for me, it's something that kind of connected a lot of the images together and pieced together the book as a whole. So it's seen throughout the regions and Y points, and also, as I discussed at the beginning, the end papers of the book are red as well, and some of the text is red, so it felt significant. So I have a bit of background in Chinese culture, but I did an internet search about the significance of the color red, and it says that red is a lucky and auspicious color in Chinese culture. Red is associated with the fire element, which represents life, vitality, and light. So it seems to be that red is something that's common in various parts of Chinese culture, and something that kind of unites the different regions, and thus to me kind of connected back to what was being shown in the book. The idea of the Yangtze as the mother river that unifies the regions and kind of gives an overall sense of place and one of identity. So which leads me to another red image. So this one is a bit different just because this one, the film was loaded back to front by accident. So it looks a bit different. I think it still fits quite perfectly in the book. So even like the line down the middle, I'm not sure if we can see my mouse, but this line here looks almost like a river to me, specifically the one of the river with the Y points that I showed at the beginning. And it gives, I think, a nice documentation of the journey as well, instead of just showing the successes of the journey. So I like that it shows kind of just general shapes in the background. It's kind of hard to tell what's there, as opposed to kind of the solid structures of the other red images. So I think it works well for me in telling of the story, both with the failures and successes along the way. All right, so my last few images, which I also think bring a nice contrast in the different ways that Preston has documented the Yangtze River, are some of the images of the river against a backdrop of industrial areas or cities. I think they're probably areas that I think wouldn't normally be photographed, as they don't necessarily show the river or maybe the regions in a positive light. But I see it as important to include as part of the journey of the river. So as we can see in this one, which is Y49, so it's 4,800 kilometers from the river source. So it's sort of nearing the end. So it has the brownish water and kind of a gray sky. And it doesn't really have a beautiful backdrop because it has ships and cranes and buildings. But it is part of the river's life and culture. So I saw it as successful in being included in the narrative and the life of the Yangtze. And then my last images here are the double spread from the book, which are Y38, 3,700 kilometers from the river source. I found it quite powerful, I guess, as an ending image for the presentation, because it has a lot of the motifs and symbolism I found evident in the narrative of the book, such as like there's this small stream that I assume, I guess, is a side shoot of the river. And it seems like it's kind of fighting to stay relevant in an area that's going through some construction on the side. So it has the shapes that I was searching for throughout the book, even in like the shape of the river, but also maybe even in the cracks of the ground in the front. But then I love the images as well, just because there's this bright color in the middle that kind of draws my eye to the back with the city in the background. And I think it's interesting to include that as well in kind of this huge backdrop of the river, because perhaps the city was originally built because it was near the river, maybe for trade opportunities or fishing, and perhaps was built and given its identity by the river. So I think it was powerful for me within the book, at least. All right. And so I guess to kind of finish up with this image, if you are interested in learning more about Mother River, you can purchase the book on Jan Preston's website, and it's £55, and I believe they are signed as well. So something else that was interesting on her website is that she has what to me is almost like an online exhibition of the work, where you could have more insight into the journey, where she has videos where she speaks about the works, and she has videos along the river. She also has a series of photos of like the different beds that she slept on while on the journey, taking the images. And lastly, you can also see installation views of the work from the various places it was shown, which I think kind of brings it back to the book as well, because when it's shown in various galleries around the world, it's shown in quite a large format as well. And the book is quite large to other photo books I have as well. So I think they kind of connect back together. All right, so that's the end of my portion of the talk. So I'll pass it over to you again, Richard.
Fantastic. That was great. Thanks very much, Samantha.
Thank you.
Yeah, really interesting, the world a bit tying together. And we'll talk about both books in a second. I'll do something similar now. And I will show a video of China Dream, if I can. All right, Can you see that?
Uh-huh.
You can, right. Very good. Sorry, 1 second. Computer's frozen for a second. Okay, so I'm gonna whiz through the book as well. I'm gonna speed it up because the idea really is to just get a feel for the design and the layout of the book. Teresa Eng is a photographic artist and she makes long-term works. She has produced 3 books: Speaking of Scars, Self-Portrait, and China Dream. Teresa Eng's parents were among the mass exodus of Chinese people who left mainland China during the communist revolution of the 50s. And she was born in Canada after her parents made their way there via Hong Kong. And China Dream spans 5 years, 2013 to 2017, during which Teresa Eng visited China to explore her ancestral roots. And the photos in the book are landscape, portrait, and still life, and it paints a picture of the areas of China which Teresa Eng visited. There is a small booklet included within the book. It has a list of places that she visited to make the photographs, and there's a short essay from Vanessa Howe in Chinese and English, and the colophon from the publisher there. And overall, the book speaks of the Chinese diaspora, and perhaps more personally for Teresa, it considers the effects of being a second-generation immigrant whilst meditating upon the physical state of being in one place, while at the same time being present elsewhere emotionally or spiritually. And I guess experiencing that place through a rapid rate of change that China's going through. Okay, so that's a quick look at the book. I will also share a PowerPoint. Okay, hopefully you can see that.
Yep.
Okay, great. Okay, so China Dream took its name from a patriotic calendar that Teresa Eng saw on a news kiosk when she was visiting China. And it's also a slogan that was used by the president in 2013 in China. And I guess it could also be compared to the American dream, which is a dream of financial independence, opportunity, and upward mobility. So we'll take a look at the cover, and the cover is a kind of buff paper, similar to a packaging, packing paper that you would put around boxes and things like that. And then there's a small photograph which is embossed into the corner there. There's no text on the front or on the back. The only text is on the spine, and that has the title of the book and the name of the author. And then once you open the book, there's no end papers at the front. You're just straight into the book. And there's the binding here, which I was trying to figure out what a binding was. I didn't want to take it apart, but it could be a Swiss type binding, but it's covered in a black fabric. And usually books which are Swiss bound, the books would tend to be left open. I don't know if you can see that. So you can actually see the stitching, but the stitching in this book has been concealed, and that's kind of a theme that runs through the book as well, this concealment or hiding stuff from view. The photograph is taken through a window, and you can see that there's a Chinese engraving. And then the photograph, I was trying to figure out, it looks like a big truck or a lorry. And what that really says to me is it's kind of comparing the traditional culture versus the development that China is experiencing. And then the very next page, it shows what I assume to be a cherry blossom, and maybe representing, at first I thought it would be maybe representing new growth. I suppose on reflection, it could also be a reference to cultural heritage and tradition. I know some of these bonsai trees can be hundreds of years old. And it's interesting for me the way that it's shot and printed. It kind of brings to mind an ancient painting. It's very dark and mysterious, haunting even. And that's an aesthetic which runs throughout the book. Pairings and sequencing are devices which Teresa Eng employs throughout the narrative. And these images communicate with each other visually, but they also speak of the natural world versus the manufactured. And I think it's quite an interesting juxtaposition, because we have the status symbol of owning a car, as well as a more intimate and vision of personal aspirations. So this plant has carvings into it, and at the back here you can't really see, but it's got 3 letters LOV. So it's the more personal aspirations versus the financial aspirations, which I guess could be perceived in the concept of the American dream and the Chinese dream. And it may be seen as a propaganda tool to promote the aspiration of individual self-improvement in Chinese society, with the hope that the country becomes more prosperous through the endeavors of collective hard work. The title page is a few pages in, and it's the only text printed within the book. There is a separate booklet with text, and we'll look at that. But the scarcity of text leaves the work open to interpretation. The images were printed in the darkroom, where Teresa Eng experimented and made images which reflected the continuous change of deconstruction and reconstruction as China strove towards becoming an economic superpower. And she describes experience in a country in flux, with cities undertaking a dizzying rate of rapid urbanization. And again, this pairing illustrates the natural juxtaposed with infrastructural change. I'm going to actually brighten my screen because I don't know if you can see that. That's probably better. So the image on the left, you have 3 people walking across what could be an ancient bridge and in a river setting coming out of the forest, and that kind of leads nicely into the highway here that's also been built over a forest. And then in the background, you can't see it in this image, but there's another city in the haze. And this image immediately follows the last image, and it's not clear what the tarpaulin is covering. It could be shielding a construction site from view. It could be a barrier to stop debris falling into a public space. And the way it's shot, the artist isn't giving much away. It's the close crop, so it keeps us guessing. But when you look at it straight after the image of the road, and the barrier in the road and the lines and things like that, it kind of lends itself to interpretation. This portrait is a sequence of 3 images, and there's 2 portraits and a tall building, which we can assume, I suppose, is a residential building, and then the second portrait of the same person. And because there's no text, there's nothing really to guide us other than the images, and our understanding of the relationship between the sitter and the building is just left to our own interpretation, and we make assumptions based on his body language and our own personal view of the world and of China. There's also images which show development, and the images they are rather hazy, and it evokes feelings of pollution that arises from constant demolition and rebuilding that Teresa Eng describes. And this is just a close-up of a construction site. There's poetic images and sequential narratives which are paired together. And Teresa Eng speaks of buildings that she'd photographed in the past that had been demolished when she revisited and replaced with new buildings. So she witnessed endless cycles of destruction and reconstruction. And perhaps this conflicted with her own images of traditions of Chinese culture. She never lived in China. So perhaps there's a disconnect there. And here's the gatefold. So the gatefold creates a tip trick. When you first get to the spread, there's just one picture, and then when you open it, it becomes a triptych. And on the flip side of the third image, there's a blank page, and maybe this also alludes to new growth as well. There's some young shoots in the center there. And there is a dreamlike quality to many of the images, which alludes to a feeling of loneliness or perhaps detachment and disconnect. And this dreamlike aesthetic also plays along with the title of the book, China Dream. And I think when you're looking through the book, you get a sense of a country in the midst of losing its identity, maybe. And perhaps there are cultural clashes, which are all part of the deconstructing of the past to accommodate the future. This image really intrigues me. I mean, it's another dark and distant image. I mean, she's quite far back. And, perhaps the distance reflects how the artist feels about searching for some kind of connection with a country that she doesn't know so much about. But it's really interesting to me that in this city, there's no lights on. I looked and I couldn't see any lights on, and I think it struck me as kind of strange, really, to have a city with no lights at all, even in the dead of night. But and then I will end up on some images which I found particularly evocative. This one and this one run in sequence. And again, we're kind of covering over and cloaking, and we don't know what's under here. We can draw our own assumptions what it is, but we don't actually know. And it's quite intriguing, but it kind of feels like it gives a sense that something is ending and there's some uncertainty around that. But then you have this image on the following page, which also kind of is a new beginning as the tree starts to blossom there. And this one grabbed me because it's kind of futuristic. It's like a big screen or something. Through a dark neighborhood, there's a big screen, and it's kind of Orwellian, which again speaks to the future. Although that was 1984, so no, that's the past. But anyway. And this one you can't really see, but it's quite interesting, the color. So as I said before, she kind of experimented with lots of different coloring throughout the images in the work. And this one, it brings to mind the coloring of the koi carp on the front of the book. There. But also, when you take a close look, this area here, it looks like some paving under the water, but it looks like the scales of a fish. So it's really interesting. And then 2/3 of the way into the book, there's the little booklet, and that includes a list of locations where Teresa Eng made the work, and an essay by Vanessa Howe called Collecting Chinese Notes from the Diaspora. And in the essay, she writes of over 60 million living in the diaspora. And she describes them as people who fled bandits, floods and famine for a better life abroad. And the writer's parents fled China in the 60s. And she said they aspired to attend grad school before gaining employment, which would sponsor their parents, their siblings, their spouses, nieces and nephews. And she describes this economic emigration as changing the course of dozens of lives. And she also writes that after spending many years in the US as US citizens with deep roots in the country, that her family was still perceived as foreigners because they look different. And she describes her exploration of the diaspora as a search for belonging, a seeking out of people who have also experienced the tug between homelands adopted and ancestral. And when she visits China from the US, she's regarded as a foreigner there too, and she doesn't fit in. And rather poetically, she says that she exists in the liminal, the in-between between Chinese American, the hyphen between Chinese American. And this is the end of the book. So there's black end papers, which kind of give the sense of a kind of switching off, or the final scene, or the curtain drawing to a close. And then just with a quick note on the typeface in this booklet, the typeface is the same typeface that's used by the People's Daily newspaper, which is the official newspaper of the Communist Party in China. Okay, so that's me stopping there. So that's the end of my presentation, where we will start to discuss. If anybody wants to say anything, you're more than welcome. We can unmute you, or you can unmute yourself maybe, if you want to say anything.
Yeah, I think they can unmute themselves. So I know someone made a comment in the chat that it says, Tracy Pattison says, it strikes me both books deal with issues of climate change very beautifully.
Yeah, I think it does as well. And I mean, they're two very different books, which both address a journey through China. Obviously, Jan Preston's book is much more of a linear narrative, whereas the images in Teresa Eng's book, for me, because there's no linear narrative that I can figure out, it feels like a search.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. I was going to say, yes, I guess I didn't really address climate change directly in mine, but I guess it's something that I see in both as well. I think in Preston's, it's maybe more direct, because I guess the ones that maybe deal with climate change are more of the landscape ones, where you can see the change in the color of water, or maybe like the industrial cities in the background. But I guess I think in Teresa Eng's, hers are just kind of, I guess I see it in kind of the haze of the images, with the industrial backgrounds, or like, I guess in just kind of the colors, like in something like this. I think you can see it in that as well. So I guess they're different visually, but I think, yeah, I agree. Now, has Eng ever spoken about the content of the book?
Yeah, I think she has. Not to me. Both artists know that we're doing this, by the way, but yeah, no, she hasn't spoken to me about it, but there are some interviews online. I don't know into how much detail she goes, but things that I read just really say that she never lived in China. So I think the first time she went to China was to make this work. And the idea for going there and undertaking this project was to kind of reconnect. And I think she was going and coming back, and then going and coming back. She lives in England now. But it must have been a little bit disconcerting to see the rapid rate of change. I know I don't go home very often, but even the small town where I come from, it's a tiny little town, but the last time I went back, all the roads have changed, and I couldn't actually find my way out. You know, and I was surprised by the rapid rate of construction that's going on.
Yeah, I guess to kind of piggyback on what you were saying, I guess, as well, is that I think they both live in England now, but they both kind of, what stood out to me as, I guess, the similarities between the books, that they're both kind of about a sense of identity in relation to China, even though they both live away from it. But I guess they look at similar aspects, I think, as well, such as like the different people. I mean, yours has kind of different portraits than maybe Preston's would, and the nature and the modernization, but very different visually and structurally. So I think it's interesting to look at.
It is interesting, yeah. And I think one thing that you get in Yan's book, because she did this, you get a kind of, you get an image of the vastness of China with the varying landscapes as well, which is quite fascinating. I mean, I don't really know much about China at all, but you pointed out that the landscape changes from the icy heights down, which kind of reminds me of Alex Soth when he did Sleeping by the Mississippi.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, he started in the north, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the Mississippi goes the whole length of North America.
Yes, even that's going to show my bad geography. I'm not sure.
It just nod.
It's long.
Yeah, yeah, I think it does. I think it goes the whole length. And he purposely started in the north where it was cold, and he wanted it to get warmer. And I suppose maybe that feeds into climate change as well, I don't know. But anyway, he wanted it to get warmer, the colours get warmer, and you definitely see that in Yan's book. But also the physicality of the book. I mean, I've got a copy here as well. I mean, it is a big book.
Yeah.
And the weight of it, and we were talking about things that interest us about the photo book as an object, and you get a sense for, so I think I read somewhere that somebody described it might even be in the essay, as an odyssey, the journey that she took to make this work. And I think the book, well, I think she shot on a 5:4 as well. So it's kind of large format, which suits the size. I guess the images in the book are kind of 8x10. So it helps the images, but also the physicality and the size of the book kind of gives you a feel for the journey that she undertook as well. I'm just seeing if I made any notes here.
I guess some other things that I noticed as well is that, I mean, this is something simple as well, but they both used red text. So I guess China Dream has the red text as well. But I also think they use shapes in a similar way, kind of like I was describing, where they're the river shapes and then the mountains. And so you can kind of see it flow along. But I had saved a page where, I mean, like, maybe this isn't the best one, but I guess you have like on this side, you have the winding hare, which connects to the winding road on the other side, which I think is quite nice.
Yeah, and also you can't see where the hare ends either.
No, yeah.
You don't know how long that actually is. And Teresa Eng, she did actually make a picture of the river as well, which I didn't show. But I think there was an interesting aspect about the way in which Yan Preston decided where to make the photographs at 100-kilometer stages, but she didn't know what she was going to find when she got there. So that's really interesting as well. And the images, I mean, they really are remarkable.
It's cool. Richard, if I may add something, you can't see me, but I've unmuted myself briefly. So thanks so much for the presentation. It's both really great, really nice to see the books side by side, actually, or like one after the other, rather. What I'm kind of find myself wondering now after seeing both is kind of what you make of how personal or not personal the books feel. It seems quite strange that, I mean, both of them, there's a lot about kind of scale, I suppose, and like the different perspectives. So you have these like wide, you know, majestic landscapes, and then you have portraits and interiors, and it kind of, both books tend to move between all of these. But somehow, like in China Dream, okay, it calls itself China Dream, and I think that's really quite yeah, it feels very much like a dream, or like this symbiosis between all the images, and they all seem kind of accidental or unplanned, but somehow they work together, a bit like in a dream where you you have very little control over what kind of images come to you. So for me, I think that even though she kind of sets out to do this, I suppose some of the images also feel a bit disembodied or something, or especially the one you were discussing, with the buildings, it seems to be taken from so far away. It's as if, it's so different from the one of the person just inside. Or I just feel like it moves really beautifully between all these different perspectives, but manages to kind of have multiple perspectives, so to speak. And then the other one kind of sets out to say, oh, I'm going to cover these points that are sort of non-conventional or accidental, but somehow seems a lot more, taken by the same person, or like from the same, I was there and I positioned so it feels a bit, it wants to be about the river, but for me, it kind of leaves me with this thing that the photographer is very, very present. So I don't really know, I'm just kind of rambling, but I'm just wondering how it feels to you in terms of, how personal these images.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point that you just made about the structure of the of Jan Preston's work. I mean, it definitely feels as though that there is some kind of formality there, whereas Teresa Eng's a little bit more dreamlike, as you explained there. And I wonder if that is because she had quite a strict plan of how she was going to execute the work, whereas maybe Teresa Eng went and she just kind of shot more intuitively.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, I think as well, I think it helps, I guess, to have more of kind of a personal insight with her diary at the end. But I guess, I think for me, it felt more like a combination of her own experience of the Yangtze and also trying to include, I guess, the different cultures that live around the river. And so I guess for me, there are a few that feel more personal. I guess the one where I showed where she was standing at the river's edge, that felt quite personal, but she also did performances at some of the different sites, which I didn't really talk about. So I guess there's a lot of other information out there, but yeah, I guess it's something.
Well, there's also the diary entry, which is pretty.
Yeah, the diary entry. Yeah, and I think as well on her website you can buy pictures of the beds that she slept in along the journey, and I think, if I'm correct, on the back of each one she's written like a small note about the place there. So I mean, there's places where you can find more insight into her personal journey as well. I guess it's just hard maybe because she had the Y points to share more of a personal journey.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just reading down the questions here quickly as well. There's one from Nuala, and she's asking, does an editor suggest where to bring intention, like a blank page, or is it the artists themselves? I think it's probably a combination of both. When I mentioned tension, if I try to think of tension, maybe somebody like Daido Moriyama, whose images are printed full bleed. So they take up the whole book. So it's very immersive. When you open the pages, it's quite immersive. And I suppose the subject matter as well. Whereas with Jan Preston's book and Teresa Eng's book, there's almost a kind of, there's almost a kind of frame around the images. There's a white frame. You see that? Whereas if there's a full, I don't think there's any full bleed in here, but where there's a full bleed picture, it creates a tension there. So I would say it's probably a combination of the artist's vision and the designer, and how it sits within the book would be my answer to that.
Yeah, I think your answer is probably good. I guess I did read some about I guess, the choices that Preston made, but I'm not sure how she interacted with the publisher, I guess, for her book.
Yeah, and I think the only real disruption in her book, aside from the actually there's the red images, but then there's the blank page as well, but then there's the double spread, which kind of throws everything. Okay, and then Yvonne says, some of the photographs in China Dream are very beautiful with a dreamlike quality, while others resemble traditional Chinese prints with the colours and shapes captured. These contrast with the more industrial pictures and the more intrusive portraits. Yeah, we don't know the relationship that the artist had with any of those sitters. So in Teresa Eng's book, there were, I think, portraits of 3 people, 2 men and a woman. And we just don't know that her relationship with the sitters. So it's hard to answer that question. And then the pictures that Jan Preston took were also a little bit distant, I think.
Well, I had read an article as well about Preston's book, and I think at one point she had been criticized for her documentary style portrait or photographs because they weren't like the traditional watercolor ones. They were more like direct, more kind of, I guess the article had said Western style photographs. So I guess that was something interesting to include. But yeah, I guess also in where she says that China Dreams had the dreamlike quality that resemble traditional Chinese prints. I think it's interesting to look at in the book as well, because I agree with that. And like, there are a lot of nature images, but I guess I won't show them now. But yeah, I guess I agree with that. And I guess I think it is interesting to see, and I think that's probably what she was intending to do, was kind of to show maybe the stereotype of what people think about of China in relation to art with newer, more modern ideas, and maybe her own experience.
Yeah, and I think I showed a couple of images with nature next to the more urbanized views. And I think she does that through the book. I mean, we only showed a small selection of pictures, but one thing that Teresa Eng does, she does pair these kind of mini narratives within the whole narrative. And Yvonne is asking about the coffin. We assume it's a coffin. I thought it might be a coffin, maybe. Covered with a shroud dripping in red. Yeah, and yeah, it kind of does evoke that kind of feeling, I suppose. And it's very dark concrete at the back. But we don't know. That's the thing. Yeah. We don't know. It is dark. Diane's saying it's dark. It is dark. Yes. Yes. Okay. I don't know if I have. Does anybody else have anything that they want to add, or? No. Okay. Well, what I'll do is quickly, because we have a couple of minutes, I will just show you what's coming up for the Photo Factory. Also, I'll give you a link here to their web pages very quickly. Okay, so that's where you can buy the books. Okay, so on Teresa Eng's website or Yang's website. So as I said at the very beginning, we tried to hold regular conversation groups, and they're meant to be really informal. So anyone is welcome to come along, especially on Zoom now, because we have this wider reach. Everyone's welcome. And when you come, you can have your camera on or off, it doesn't matter. Very informal. And some of the books that we have coming up, this is quite an interesting book by Thana Farok. It was published this year by Dutch publisher Lecturis. And it's interesting because it's made, she is a Yemeni refugee, and she's also a photographer. So it's an interesting perspective seeing work on refugees from an actual refugee. So it's quite an interesting book. And actually, in terms of tension, this book is very good. It's a very good example of tension. so another Sophie Cowell book, which is a really interesting book. If you don't know it, I would recommend coming to that one. It's called Because, and it was published in 2019 by Editions Xavier Barral. It's going to be an interesting one to present because there's no actual pictures on the pages. But if you want to learn more, you have to come and have a look. Rich Gilligan, who's an Irish photographer, he made a book called DIY, published in 2014 by Preston. This one is a Mac published book. It's called An Attic Full of Trains, and it was curated by Carlotta Di Leonardo, and I think it's from her. I'm not sure if it's her father's or if it's her grandfather's. Had an attic full of photographs, and all of the photographs have been made into a photo book. So it's kind of interesting because she's elevating the photographs to fine art, to put into a fine art photo book. That was published in 2020 by Mac. Still Here by Vivian Rush. She's a German photographer. It's quite an interesting book. Excuse me. It was published in 2020 by Kara. It's a tough book. It's quite a tragic book. It's a very brave book, so that's an interesting one. And then one of my old favourites is Red-Headed Peckerwood, which was first published by Mac in 2011, and that's Christian Patterson, and that's a fascinating book as well. And if you haven't seen it, then I would recommend you come along to that one. Also, yes, dead right, Rishi. The red is the colour of the communist.
Yeah, I saw that as well.
Okay, well, I think that's it. So if nobody else has anything further to ask or say, yep, it could also be a reference.
Yeah, it could be it too.
Okay, so very good. I think that's us then.
All right.
Okay.